the chief proprietor, restorer, and publisher at Comic Strip Appreciation Group, where he resurfaces long runs of often obscure and forgotten American and British newspaper strips of the last century. We're talking everything from post-Roy Crane Captain Easy to Tailspin Tommy, the post-Neil Sickles Scorchy Smith, to strips you may never even have knew existed, like 30 Paige, Jim Hardy, and Adam Ames, among many others. Initially, Stefan posted these restorations on his site and sold them as downloadable PDFs. But as the quality and the accessibility of print-on-demand platforms like Lulu have evolved, he's taken to selling hard copies of many of these titles. As of this morning, I counted about 25 CSAG titles available on Lulu. So let's get to know the man behind all of this incredible output of classic comics and see what he has in store. Stefan, welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
So, before getting into comics, give us some of the backstory. What were you doing before devoting your life to resurfacing old strips?
Well, before this, as of December 31st of last year, I worked at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. in exhibition design. I'd been doing that for 31 years. Worked in graphic design, worked on all the exhibitions, and towards the last decade and a half, so designed a few of the graphics there. Um, was involved in shows like Philip Guston, Dorothea Lange, and the last show I did was photography in the Black Arts Movement. We had to, scheme up entrances to lure people in, graphic designs, and the type for shows. It was a very heavily deadline-oriented job, but it was one of the best things I've ever done. The
Hmm.
people there were fantastic and could never stop learning about new things.
Well, if
Um,
anybody who's seen this who has not been to the National Gallery, you know whereof you speak. It's really it's a gorgeous gallery and some just one of the absolute must-sees if you're in DC.
um, I have a background in the arts.
Hmm.
I went to Carnegie Mellon for undergraduate in painting, and then went to NYU for my master's. From a family of artists. My mom was a clothes designer, and my father was an architect. And,
Oh,
my
wow.
grandfather was also Puerto Rican. He was from Puerto Rico. I'm half Puerto Rican on my mother's side, and he was part of the he was part of the photography movement in the 30s, but he was also one of the first Spanish artists to produce mass-produce greeting cards in New York City, and he did a
Hmm.
lot of folk art that's are in museums. So I have a history.
So you really you come to a love of comic strips and the arts honestly here. This is
Sure.
not just a sideline. So when you were growing up, what were some of your favorite strips? I mean, I think all of us have like a childhood story of embracing this form. So I'm curious, how did you experience it as a kid?
Well, growing up in the mid to late 70s and early 80s, it was looking back, I realized it was a strange time to sort of jump into that because it was a big transition with the
Right.
70s inflation. Comics rose from like 15 cents from the year I was born to 40 cents by the end of the decade.
Mhm.
But I sort of latched onto comic books. I was more of a DC person than Marvel. Marvel was someone that was touching 10 years old. It was a little bit too mature in terms of subject matter. I
Mhm.
enjoyed sort of the more relative, simplistic storylines of like Superboy, which had been put out again, and
Mhm.
Shazam, the second iteration that DC had done. Um, I just was never into X-Men ever at all.
Mhm.
And then I only grew to appreciate Spider-Man many, many years later with Ditko and especially John Romita, who I think
Mhm.
was the best of them all of that run. But I just never got into it. For comic strips, it's funny when you grew up in the late 70s, early 80s, you didn't have a sense that you were basically in the middle of a revival
Mhm.
of strips, meaning that Buck Rogers came back for Sundays,
Mhm.
um, Tarzan too, but there was Star Wars that had Sundays.
Right.
I think Star Trek too had a brief run, but I got exposed to it through Washington Post, and they were I guess in terms of strips more into the humor stuff. The Washington Star had just folded in 1980, and that
Mhm.
was the DC's main paper until then. But
Mhm.
um, uh, my favorite strips at the time, Henry fascinated me because of the words.
Hmm.
Nancy, for obvious reasons. The adventure strips didn't kick hold for me until much later.
Hmm.
I the Dick Tracy stuff, you know, and Prince Valiant too. I mean, the Prince Valiant stuff, I recognized that Cullen Murphy's work was good, but you felt like you were getting involved into a story that had been
Sure.
way before
Right.
you had started. So
Right.
you,
Right.
you couldn't follow at that point, having no point of reference to work from.
Yeah.
Um, but Bloom County, really, Bloom County and the Far Side were the two 80s
Right.
strips that defined everything. And quite honestly, they were the funniest of the bunch, and I
Hmm.
enjoyed those. For better or for worse, towards the end of the decade, as I
Hmm.
as I got older, I realized what a really good strip that was, and yeah. But that was those were the times that I was exposed to.
So how did the comic strip appreciation group take shape? When did you start at it, and what inspired you to start doing this?
Well,
Going
it
digging up a lot of
began.
old strips.
Yeah, it began actually as a Facebook group from someone else that he and I had a conversation that we needed to have a place where we could trade hard to find reproductions of
Hmm.
books. Like we couldn't find the Wash Tub Captain Easy, the
Hmm.
Flying Buttress editions of certain
Right.
things. So it was just a common meeting ground for people to swap stuff or sell stuff on the cheap because the prices on Amazon or eBay were getting out of control.
Hmm.
And in the pursuit of the Roy Crane material of wash tubs, I found on eBay a bunch of someone had compiled in scrapbooks about a half dozen of them, Leslie Turner periods, up to about
Hmm.
from 1943 up to about 1952.
Hmm.
And I negotiated a price and I got them all. And then I took pictures of them and posted them on the group, and people loved it. And I'm like,
Hmm.
cool. Yeah, that's really nice. And then someone said, if you subscribe to newspapers.com, something like that, you can find more of those strips. And I'm like, okay, go on there, and I'm starting to look around. And then it just occurred to me, well, why don't I start, taking clips and then putting them on a
Hmm.
page and making a bunch of pages and then just posted them. And then that sort of took off by itself. And then the guy who started it sort of gave control of the forum to me. And this was what, 2019.
Hmm.
And then, COVID happened, and then that was sort of the kept me going during that time. Started posting, doing year by year of certain strips.
Hmm.
And I was always fascinated by the things I would find. You look up one strip and then it was on a page with some other strip that you never heard of, and then you follow that
Hmm.
thing, and it's sort of like a rabbit hole maze that you keep following. And you realize there's a whole world of strips of artists and cartoons that were done that sort of fly by night, maybe six
Right.
months, maybe 2 years, maybe five, but they're all very interesting. And some of them were even nationally famous and then before disappearing as the times changed. So
Hmm.
I got fascinated by that. I started learning more about American popular culture in a different sense than I had before. I was into old time radio, but this was different. This was a visual medium that had more of an impact on a daily basis, and there was so much that I learned that realized that the current even the current history books on comic strips they're not wrong. They're just incomplete, and I
Hmm.
think they're incomplete in the sense that there were a lot of more women cartoonists. I think Trina Robbins was always
Right.
banging the drum on that, and she was right. And not only were they there, they were actually famous and were in big magazines. There were
Yep.
African American cartoonists. There was subject matters were quite interesting. It wasn't always the blonde hair, blue eyed, Flash Gordon type adventure. There were blonde hair, blue eyed female adventurers,
Right.
Connie and
Right.
Flying and Jenny Dare and a bunch of others.
Right.
But and it wasn't, stereotypes didn't seem to fit what was actually being done until like maybe 1960 when you had that nuclear family type of thing and the type of stories that were being told became homogenized. So it's just fascinating. It's
Well,
just really
I think
fascinating.
you're making a really good point about the diversity that's always been there, that the standard history. which I think was written, admittedly, and we were all in that group. I'm certainly in that group. I'm old enough to be in that group of sort of graying guys who really appreciated a certain narrow set of great artists, and there was sort of a canon that came down over the years, and it informed and colored most of the histories. But once you start getting into a trove like what newspapers.com allows us now, is to start really starting to see these pages and suddenly say, what strip is that? We never heard of that before. None of the histories
Right.
ever talked to that about that. And we suddenly realized that there actually was quite a breadth out there. Because they were serving, these newspapers were serving a mass audience. They were trying to grab a lot of different segments, and those weren't necessarily the segments that ended up writing the histories, and were attracted to certain strips. So I think I'm sorry, I'm extending and making your own point, but I think it's a very good point about that you're opening up a history of strips that in some sense wasn't told just because of the nature of, that generation of historians.
Sure. I mean, if Maurice Horn had access to the internet, his book would be completely different,
Right.
and I would believe. And I just finished work today on the second volume of Flying Jenny, and she's an
Hmm.
interesting example because so you have a female-led strip, an adventure strip, and her she's it's a working girl type of strip with a twist. She
Hmm.
is trying to establish herself in a man's world of aviation, and she's quite capable of and self-assured, and she makes the unusual decision early on in the strip to not marry,
Hmm.
even though she's got this boyfriend that's devoted to her. And it's all the things that would come up. And I saw this in Ella too, Ella Cinders.
Right.
The changing of the name, you got to stop your career so you can have babies and things like that. And she just said, no, this is who I am. This is what I need to do. I need to fly,
Hmm.
and I'm not giving anything away. By the end of the strip, the last strip, she says the same thing, is a reiteration of this theme that I am meant to be a pilot and my dream is to be able to fly. And in 1939 through 1946, this is really unusual. This is a really usual statement to make by two male creators of the strip.
Although it would resonate during the 40s, especially during the Rosie the Riveter era. Riveter era.
Right.
And in fact, there were a number of, in fact, I had one in my family. There were a number of female test pilots in the 1940s
Right.
who worked for companies like Cessna. And so she was speaking to something that was happening in the culture, but it was then very quickly forgotten historically
Yes.
what we went
Yeah.
through, and reviving somebody like something like Flying Jenny really helps reiterate something and remind us of a historical moment that in some sense America tended to forget. In fact, we went the opposite direction after World War II.
Right, and it's part of the intent of this. I'll abbreviate it, the
Hmm.
CSAG imprint, to concentrate on strips like that. Creators strips of, um, that they were personal to some of these artists that they got
Sure.
onto, a national forum to do their work, which is, unheard of today because it's so commercialized and business oriented. But
Right.
these were artists that were able to do, commercially viable things, even if it only lasted a couple of years. Some of them
Hmm.
lasted 2 years and then they stopped because they didn't have any more to say, or the artist got sick and passed away, or a lot
Right.
of variety of other things. And I'm interested in that. That's why I
Mm.
did strips, collected books like Nick Halliday and Marlon Keel, which I put out last week. These were two 50s adventure strips that were both nautical based. In fact, they
Mm.
debuted the same day in different papers in the fall of
Mm.
'53. I find Nick Halliday to be one of the best drawn strips of the 1950s, right up there with Casey Ruggles, the Warren Tufts strip,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Lance. It just captures everything about, the adventure strips that I love, where it's sort of one foot grounded in reality. The guy's running a business and he encounters people that, treasure hunters,
Hmm.
thieves, lovers, things like that. And, these were just very personal to the artist. He incorporated the author of Russell Keats, I think his name is. He incorporated his wife as the
Keaton, yeah,
girlfriend. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
Petrie.
yeah.
He incorporated his wife as the girlfriend. So there's like a lot of personal ties to the strip that
It's I
use.
think that again a really good point because it's the intimacy of this medium and that even though it was one of the big mass media of all and in fact it was being run by syndicates who had a lot of say in what went in and didn't go in on a day-to-day basis these artists were able to connect with their readers in a very intimate way and they could insert things into the strips and they could take perspectives that were really very personal and I think that was communicated in a very intimate way because of the way these strips connect with people.
Right, right. And so and there's some culturally interesting ones. Ella Cinders, because of
Hmm.
the her her unusual features of this very 20s cartoony, classic cartoony Art Deco face that
Right.
never changed in the 30, 40-year run that it had. Yet early on, she was a play on Cinderella, this poor girl with the older sisters that tried to
Hmm.
abuse her in every which way, and she pulls herself out of it with her, itinerant younger brother,
Right.
and they go in and out of from poverty to wealth and back again, and she never quite achieving, her goal of finding, the right
Right.
guy to complete her life. But, it was interesting to find out that this was the first strip that was made. It was so popular, they made a movie,
Right.
a year and a half later after the
Right.
founding. So there's culturally, these strips were very impactful to popular culture.
Well, I mean, the fact that how many pieces of popular culture do people know 40, 50, 60 years after they first appeared? I mean, we know these characters. We
Right.
know everybody, even those who never read a newspaper, know Dick Tracy and
Hmm.
Popeye. I mean, these are resonant characters, and no other kind of pop culture really has resonated and lasted this long and
Right.
become embedded in the culture. Tell us a little bit about the process. Now, you say you're using a lot of internet sources, so newspapers.com, I'm sure is a trove for this stuff. But as we all know, those of us who also subscribe to newspapers.com know that there's some really uneven quality to some of these
Oh
newspapers.
yeah.
So
No, it's
tell us a little bit about what you have to go through and what tools you use to make these much more presentable. And they are. I mean, the volumes that I have certainly show there must be a fair amount of work that's going into this.
well, I mean, there's you know, you can purchase, strips, from clippings on eBay and things like that. There tend to
Hmm.
be batches from sellers, but from newspapers.com, I mean, it's a multiple process. You have to find the strip, collate them, make
Hmm.
clippings, assemble them, clean them up, and then finalize them. And
Hmm.
I used to use Adobe Creative Suite, but cost considerations and
Hmm.
other things, I don't use that anymore. I use Affinity. Affinity is fantastic. It does about 95% of what Adobe does, and it's now free. So I mean, the complete package is available to anybody to use. But when looking for sources, you can't be satisfied with just one. You'll be lucky if you can lock on to one newspaper for a good run of the strip. Scorchy
Hmm.
Smith is actually one that I can because there's a California paper that just did a really nice job with scanning their source file papers.
Hmm.
But you got to clip them, and then I put them in folders of one for each month for that particular year. It's all about organization. You get,
Hmm.
and then you go through month by month of opening them up into Affinity has a Photoshop type of program, and I go in that, and you crop them. You have to adjust for skew because they're not shot directly at a 90-degree angle. They're shot at a
Hmm.
slight angle, or the
Hmm.
page may be slightly bowed because it's like a book. It's in a book form, and you got to correct those things, and that takes time. And then you got to like make sure that you adjust levels so that you can get the bright white and the darkest black, and then there's pinholes everywhere because the print quality stinks, and you go in with a
Hmm.
brush, fill it in, but try not to, do too much that affects the artwork. And Sharpen
And
them, always sharpen them. So it's a lot of work, but I've done it. I must have done, I think I've done several 100,000 of these, over the past 7 years, to where it's like second nature. I can identify and immediately within like 30 seconds do a day. And then I mean I can do 6 months at a time in a half day, easy, and then just collate them and put them in a page layout program, also in Affinity, 2 or 3 strips at a time, bang them out. So it's
God
a
bless you.
process.
It took me, I just did like a month of Little Lefty from the Communist Daily, which has excellent scans, by the way. And my God, it must have taken me 3 or 4 days just to put them all together. And I don't think I even corrected much of them. They were decent scans. But yeah, but that's what I wanted to ask you. How long typically does it take you to produce a full volume? You're everybody on the Facebook groups is amazed at your productivity, and you're keeping us all going deep into our pockets to keep up with this stuff. How long does it usually take you to do it, and how are you being so productive?
Well, keep in mind, a lot of these are taken from the or things I had done for the Facebook group. So I still had those
Hmm.
files. Now I'm not
Hmm.
using the same files for the most part. I'm using it as a starting point. So in many cases, I will just lay out the book using those files, and then I'll go back in. And then this is where I'll search for better versions of those dailies. It's like, can I
Hmm.
find a better one? Or I'll have to re-download this one and clean it up. Honestly, these books are designed for 2-year runs, or if they're dailies and Sundays, they're like a year and a half. And it's not that hard for me to go through. Like I said, I can do, and I'm spending 68 hours a day on these
Hmm.
because I'm retired. I can do them in about a week, one
Hmm.
book a week, or 2 books a week, and it's keeping things going. It's once you have a system down, you can throw whatever at it. The thing that slows you down is the amount of stuff that you have to put into it. Like Jim Hardy, my gosh, Jim Hardy is a difficult strip to compile because his strips, Dick Moore's strips, were in papers that were obscure to say the least.
Yeah.
Uh, except for the Minnesota paper that I got most of the first book from. But in 1938, it got dropped from a lot of those papers. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I had a 6 month gap, and I just found the gap from papers that were just added to the newspapers.com site. These reproductions are horrible. And so I will, spend a lot of time like filling in the blacks and,
Mm-hmm.
making sharpening them and cleaning the lines up. I'm not drawing anything. Very seldom do I draw anything in there. All I'm doing is drawing in the blacks or drawing out the spots with white. And
Mm-hmm.
but it's a difficult strip, and that would take a little bit longer. But if I work within that, it's all a process. If you work within that process and stick to it, you can really
Mm-hmm.
crank stuff out. But I would say I can do 2 books a week, but I really do plan. Not the weather's getting nice. I mean, I'd rather do 4 books a month,
Mm-hmm.
and especially so I can spend time doing some things of my own personal, and also spend more time with my son when school is out. But it's not that hard to crank it through once you have everything in place.
Well, tell us about the publishing piece of this. Now, when did you really only started on Lulu, what, 6 months ago?
December, really.
Yeah.
People in around October, November were talking to me about from on Facebook or about you should really try to publish this. And I'm like, well,
Hmm.
where can I find a place that I can publish without being overburdened with stock
Right.
and front loading a lot of things? And someone mentioned Lulu.com, and so I took a
Hmm.
look at it. And this was at the same time that I was in conversations with Charles Pelto at Classic Comics Press.
Hmm.
He wasn't in the best of health in the fall, and I had offered to help him out because I we were on furlough, and after furlough, I
Hmm.
was officially going to be retired. So I'm like, I had all the time in the world, And he also mentioned Lulu.com. So I took a look at it, and we had this conversation going back and forth about how to navigate through the process.
Hmm.
Lulu.com has a lot of things to help a fledgling publisher with like templates or guidelines to follow, and just went ahead and did it. And the first book that I did, which was in December, was the Adam Ames book.
Hmm.
And I was sweating over that because I had no idea what to expect. I did a proof. The blacks were too light. I went back in, tried to figure out what was wrong, and then learned what was needed to produce what made into a good book. And
Hmm.
so from there, that was it. And then Curtis Finley, who was the Library of American Comics, he and I had always been in conversation because he was part of the Facebook group. And when I
Hmm.
mentioned that I was going to start doing this, he, um, chipped in and said, I would like to help you doing covers. I'm like, sure.
Hmm.
So we've been, um, great collaborators in that regard. And, he helps me out being a second set of eyes because, like, you can't do everything yourself. You got to have someone to
Right.
make
Right.
sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and make sure you didn't duplicate strips and things like that. So he's been doing that for me. And but yeah, Lulu.com is I love the fact that you just upload PDFs and it's there. And when
Hmm.
you choose to publish through the bookstore, you do it and you let people know. And you don't have to have stock in your place. I don't have to be surrounded by like 1,000 books that I had to put pre-order and
Right.
then ship out. Lulu does it itself and anywhere in the world. So that was liberating to someone like
Hmm.
me. That was just,
And they also print it pretty well. I mean, Amazon always had an on-demand printing
yes,
process, and there were um, several people who were reprinting comics on that platform. I can't say that I was ever all that happy with the ones that I ordered that were clearly coming from Amazon. I'm just not sure if their publishing process was really up to snuff. Lulu seems to be quite different. I think most of the books that you and Charles are putting out through Lulu, and I'm also seeing from others, are
mhm,
Jim Davidson's another one who just put out the Mopsy book. They really are nice. I mean, nice, nice paper stock, holds the black ink, which is so important to what we're doing here, and
yeah.
decently bound as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think they just do a really good job. I think maybe their emphasis on photography books lends towards that
Mm.
for our purposes. I just received the Bruce Gentry book, which is my first color four-way.
Hmm.
A, a volunteer from Arnold from Europe had supplied Color Sundays, so this was a first venture into that, and it came out really well. I was really
Hmm.
pleased. And I think people who buy it are going to be really pleased. And it's great that, at least on this small scale, that, someone like me can produce something like that for the public that is of quality. I mean, I
Hmm.
really want to put out quality stuff and not something that's just a knockoff. I do recognize, though, that, the source material does limit you. So that means I have to spend a lot more time finding good sources.
Hmm.
Uh, so.
Oh, which sort of brings us to the scale of all this. Is there a business here? I mean, is how much of a market is there for people like us, and how many people will buy books of these kinds?
I think it's just the love of the medium, to be honest. I
Hmm.
don't see there's some money to it, but it's not. I mean, I was told that, like if the Steve Canyon series could not evolve past 1970 because it couldn't
Hmm.
sell,
Right.
500 copies, then, that tells you that there aren't that many people that are going to purchase these type of books. It's
Hmm.
going to be a very limited audience. So I see the CSAG imprint as a boutique, you know,
Hmm.
press type of publication because it's going to appeal to a very small number of people that really appreciate that. If it grows beyond that, great. I'd rather have it grow by word of mouth than, just really promoting out of it because it's not, to me, it's not a business. It's a hobby. It's a love of the
Hmm.
medium. And, I know there's plenty of other people that appreciate that kind of stuff. And so I think it's good to put forth that effort. And it's also, part of our history too.
Hmm.
This is very interesting stuff that was done and should not be lost, in some way.
I think, well, it'd be interesting to see how flexible the Lulu platform becomes. I mean, some of the other people that I've interviewed for this and who do reprints, Nat Gertler over at About Comics, Chris Arufo at who does the Alley reprints. They One of the things that they found is that people come at comics from a lot of different ways, and they find surprising audiences outside the fold of comics fans when they have something that appeals to the aviation nuts who are not interested in comics, but they see, say, a Flying Jenny and say, "Wow, a woman flyer in the 1940s. That's interesting." And they actually find ways of selling some of their books in specialized museums. And to various groups that come at these comics from very different directions from what you and I might be used to. And I don't,
Right.
it'll be interesting to see. And they're like distributing through things like museums and small gift shops in certain, tourist areas that would be relevant to a given volume. It'd be interesting to see if Lulu's marketing platform is flexible enough that we could actually find some of those niches of interest.
Sure. I mean, I'm grown so much in this type of field in only, 6 months. And,
Mhm.
who's to say that it couldn't evolve into something else? But, it's sort of a wait and see, we'll see what happens. I'll
Right.
just it's just me keep going and getting the word out, but word of mouth, people review, people review it, people see it and,
Hmm.
maybe they'll enjoy it. I just don't, I'm not comfortable with the conventional, making a bunch of copies and selling them to bookstores type of thing
Right.
because I just don't think things are consumed in the same way that you and I grew up.
Hmm. Yeah. So what's next? I mean, is there a particular major project that you have coming up, a particular trove or subgenre that you've tapped into? Is there something beyond, you keep on coming out with strips and sending me to, back to Alan Holtz's, newspaper index to figure out where the hell was that? And I'd never even heard of that strip. And I'm really glad that I had this chance to talk to you to get a sense that there really is you are coming at this. You have a philosophy of doing this, and there is an
Yeah,
aim. It's not just, throwing out a whole bunch of strips nobody ever heard of, but you have an aim in mind. And I think it'd be really interesting to write about some of these from that perspective that we
sure.
discussed. But tell me about, I'm sorry, to my real question, which is what's next? Is there a particular major project that you're about to start or a particular area that you're about to tap into?
Well, it started just today with Bruce Gentry, the Ray Bailey series from 1945 to 1951. That's a big project.
Well, tell it for those of us who aren't familiar with the strip, give us just a little thumbnail why this one and why it's important or interesting.
Well, Ray Bailey was an assistant to Milton Caniff, and
Hmm.
he went on his own to do his own strip. It's a very Caniff inspired looking strip with a very similar, and this came out before Steve Canyon. This is like a
Hmm.
few months before Steve Canyon. They look
Hmm.
very similar, and they're both aviation pilots that go into adventure. But Gentry is based in Latin America, so these are very Latin American toned adventures. He still deals with, ex-Nazis and saboteurs and criminals
Hmm.
and things like that, but and it has a bit of a romance angle to it. But it's a very really neat looking strip with some good stories, and it's interesting to see a Caniff. There was a school of Caniff artists, and Ray
Right.
Bailey was a prominent one, and this one was just, um, like I said, it just disappeared after
Hmm.
it ended in the early 50s, and the other strip. which both Charles and I are going to be working on. Charles is concentrating on the Roy Crane, and I'm doing the Leslie Turner years is the Captain Easy,
Hmm.
Washington Captain Easy. That's a big thing, and I intend to take that all the way to at the very least 1969 when Turner stops, but I can take it all the way to the end of the strip to 1988.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm looking forward to that myself because I've never seen it, and I wouldn't have paid attention to it again just because of the bias that well, once Roy Crane was off of it, was it worth looking at? But I've heard, but I think the response on a lot of the Facebook groups is a lot of people attest to how wonderful that stretch was.
I think I would argue the Leslie Turner years are even better than the Roy Crane. Roy Crane he was great. He had this manic
Hmm.
quality to it, and I think he poured his effort into the Sundays more than the dailies towards the end of his run of the strip. And
Yeah.
that's who did most of the work was Turner at that point in time, especially with the
Hmm.
domestic stuff. The Warriors, the first book, deals with 43 to 45 of thereabouts. And I just think it showcases Leslie Turner as one of the finest cartoonists of his time. The compositions, the detail, the halftone textures. I mean, it's astonishing what this guy poured his guts into in that period of time. And it continued all the way to the end, even though he got sick and burnt out. But his I forget who wrote the stories at that time, but the stories during that period were really about there were war stories, but there were also the stories that would become hallmarks to that Leslie Turner area, where people who were grifters, schemers,
Hmm.
conspirators, they're all trying to take advantage of either Wash Tubbs's family or who started receding into the background and became more of Captain
Hmm.
Easy, going around and becoming this international problem solver. And you start
Hmm.
to see that dichotomy happen in the first book, which is already out.
Hmm.
There are other things the things I want to do is I want to complete what I started. I think I have two more volumes of Ace O'Hara to do. It
Hmm.
stops around early 60s. The third one just came out last week. I'm finishing volume two of Flying Jenny, and I want to see that through. And I do want to concentrate on finishing up Jim Hardy, which should only take two more volumes. Jim Hardy is a really interesting strip, and it morphs into another strip called Windy and Paddles,
Right.
which people will recognize more being more of a gas predecessor to Gasoline Alley, his work on Gasoline Alley.
Mm.
I'm trying to look here. Scorchy Smith, I have one more volume planned. I am willing to go into the Warriors for further. I just think the artwork and the stories really deteriorated after Robbins left.
Hmm.
I'm taking a look at it. The late 40s and early 50s were kind of really bad until Tuska came to do the art in the 50s. So I might stop with one or two more volumes of Scorchy.
Well, that's one of the things that your project and Charles's too does is we start tracking artists like Moores, who would later go on to different, fame, or Frank Robbins, and
Yeah.
we start to see the ways in which they evolved, took things from old strips and applied it to others, or in the case of Moores, sort of broke free from Chester Gould and found his own visual voice.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are some other, I'm looking at my pile here. There's some other, I have some other very short run strips that I would like to do that, it keeps me creatively going because sometimes when you work on the same bunch of strips all the time, it gets a little maddening. So you have to like
Hmm.
change it up. But there's a late 40s strip called Ken Stewart, which is another in the vein of the Nick Halliday, Marlon Keel. It lasted 2 years.
Hmm.
It's really a nice little adventure strip. But and There's another one. I can't remember the name. It's a female-led strip, and it's a very unusual one from the late 50s, and it only appeared, I think, in Washington State and Oregon papers. I forget it's called Kate something or other, but
Okay. Oh, yes, yes, I know. I think it was in Trina's last volume with Peter Maresca. I think Kate O'Neill.
Might be
Yeah,
something
I
like
think it was
that.
Kate O'Neill. One of them was invisible. Was it Kate O'Neill who was in?
Oh, that's invisible. That's invisible Scarlet O'Neill. That's
Right,
a different.
Scarlett O'Neill. Scarlett O'Neill.
That's
Yeah,
I'm not doing
yeah,
that.
yeah.
This is a different one. It's a very small run strip. But I mean, I have a pile of them. I have them all done. I just need to put them together as a book. Pieces of Eight, which was a 30s 3-year run comic strip. It was basically pictures and then text underneath,
Hmm.
like the Tarzan strips of the time.
Hmm.
But I think Hogarth apparently did some of the artwork for that.
Huh, huh.
Things like that. But yeah, just keep on. Thorne McBride from like 1960, and this is a very odd adventure strip that a military adventure strip that lasted maybe 2.5 years. Um,
Huh.
there's
Well,
no, there's yeah.
you're doing God's work, and we're the richer for it. And I really appreciate your time. Keep at
Thank you. I will.
it.